Hey, what's up, guys, and welcome to Talk with Tubbs, a petrolhead's perspective. As always, I'm your host, Tapelo, aka Tubbs, and I'm going to talk you through this podcast that deals with everything motoring. We're going to talk what's new on the market, what's old on the market, what's good on the market, and also what's bad on the market. Then we're also going to delve into some motorsport, but more focused on my favorite form of motorsport, Formula One. We're going to talk driver lineups, what we feel, react, but most of all, I'm trying to give you a petrol head's perspective. Words that come from someone who's as passionate about the industry as anyone I know. So as ever, let me not waste your time. Here we go. Talk with Tubbs is a go.
Right. So I'm back. Welcome. It's been a while. And I'm also kind of surprised it's taken me 5 races into the new season to kind of talk about the new season and just the way things have developed. Because this is huge, right? This is one of the biggest regulation changes, if not the biggest regulation changes we've seen, well, certainly in my lifetime and in my time watching Formula One. So I'd be a bit remiss not to start the podcast with this, right? Just how the season has developed so far. And I think it's interesting for one because we've got new cars. We've got new cars, new designs, new aero philosophy, and we're seeing both the positives and the negatives of this radical change. And I think certainly in my private spaces, with friends and chat on the side, I don't think as much on public platforms, but I've been critical of the cars, the new cars. But I want to start off with the positives, right? The positives were Formula One wants to get more racing in the sense of make it easier to follow, which would theoretically raise the probability of overtakes, the probability of challenge on track. And so far, I mean, 5 races in, we've had different tracks. We've had Saudi, which is fast and flowing. We've had Imola, we've had Bahrain. We've kind of had different tracks with different characteristics. And that's kind of shown how you can follow, how you can challenge, just how it works. And I think for the most part, the new regulations have met that. They've enabled cars to follow closer and for longer without necessarily compromising them too much. Obviously, it's aero, so there will always be a penalty for following closely. That's just an inherent characteristics of aero-reliant cars, but the penalty is not as big as it was, last year, the year before. Let's just say the previous era regulations, and I think that's good, right? But we're also noticing that while theoretically being able to follow closer should increase the chances of an overtake, it doesn't necessarily negate the issues we've had with Formula One when it comes to pushing the overtake. So I've seen a lot of people saying kind of past the stage of DRS and, DRS is overpowered, yada, yada, yada. I think the DRS chat, it does go in line with the regulations, is that because I know Formula One are looking to someday phase out DRS or reduce its effectiveness or reduce its impact on a race. And I will say this, the inherent nature of Formula One, by always seeking to go faster, be more efficient, be more aero focused, maximizing on those things creates a scenario where the racing will suffer. So DRS is simply a consequence of the philosophy of Formula One. So DRS will always exist in one form or another in modern day Formula One, or at least that's the way I see it, right? And they might tweak it for future to try to get it to work differently, but the overarching understanding is that DRS will always be there. So yeah. Secondly, another positive with these cars, I think I know this is something Formula One made a big talking point about. It's the cars must look good, the cars must appeal to a wider audience. Honestly, that doesn't really matter to me. Formula One has always looked good and interesting to me because of the engineering side of it. The whole stylistic and aesthetic properties of it. Yes, you can cherry pick cars from previous generations that looked good, or this was great, this was, but ultimately that's not something I care about, so it's not something I'm really going to bother and comment on. But a negative I'm going to comment on is how terrible and sluggish these cars look through the slower stuff. Now, the philosophy of these cars is to be more focused on ground effect. So the bulk of the aero has been moved from over the car to under the car. So this is why there's such a reliance on how the floor works, and this is why it's created another thing called porpoising. Look, we're deep into the season. You know what porpoising is. It's the gradual increase and decrease in aerodynamic efficiency under the car, which essentially causes the car to bounce up and down on its suspension. I think that's as simple as I can put it, right? And this phenomena, porpoising, is a consequence of cars that rely on aero, underbody aero. And this was something that was seen in Formula One in the 1970s. Now, because since then, essentially ground effect was outlawed, and the aero efficiency of the car, or the aero component, or the was moved to above the car. It's a phenomenon we haven't seen in years. So teams are still kind of trying to get on top of it, with the new ways to solve it. And we've seen some teams suffer more and some teams suffer less. Some teams have kind of are suffering from it, but they have another way to manage it. And if you want the most extreme examples of this, you look at Ferrari. Ferrari has a car that will porpoise on the straights, but once you get into the braking zone, the car virtually settles. Now, it's crazy. I still don't understand how the car does that. I'm still trying to read up and see if anyone is doing kind of an analysis on that. But it's one of the most extreme representations of how the porpoising isn't necessarily eradicated, but it's managed where it doesn't compromise your performance. And then you look at someone like Red Bull, whose car doesn't seem to porpoise that much. Yes, it can be there depending on the straight and where you're looking, but it seems to be the most complete car that doesn't necessarily suffer from porpoising. It's there, but it's minimal. It doesn't cause that big an effect. And then you look at a team like Mercedes, who are, I think, conclusively we can say they're the team that suffers the most. And as a consequence of suffering the most from porpoising, they've had to take sort of counteractive measures, which inherently hinder their race pace. They've had to raise the ride height of the car to kind of counteract porpoising. And one of the biggest problems in the first few races with Mercedes was their car seemed to carry the porpoising into the corner, not just up to the braking point, but into the corner and into the apex, which is in contradiction to what we've seen Ferrari do, where they will porpoise up until the braking zone. And once they start braking, the car settles and they can attack the corner. So Mercedes are at a situation where they seem to be carrying porpoising into the corner. So it's more so about how many compromises can we make to try and limit the effect of porpoising. And there have been many speculations and many punts, as we all do. I mean, about how do you fix this? There have been talks about active suspension, which is something that's been outlawed in Formula One rules for a long time now. I think Red Bull have a clever suspension check that they're doing. Trying not to be too technical about it, but essentially it's not active, but their suspension kind of deals with porpoising better. We've had chats, seemingly because Mercedes suffers so greatly from porpoising, in that the no side pod philosophy that Mercedes went with is what's causing the porpoising. I'm not completely convinced, because all cars seem to have a level or degree of porpoising. I think it's more around the aero package, and we know Mercedes have been suffering from drag. They've been trying to find solutions to this. Heading into Spain, we know they're trying to bring a bigger upgrade package, a new floor, which should hopefully kind of counteract the effects of porpoising. I think it's Bryson Sullivan said this properly, a natural paradigm on Twitter. he said this on a recent interview, in that the real acid test for Mercedes is, because they haven't really bought a package that deals directly with porpoising, they've been more focusing on the drag that their car produces. He said the biggest acid test is more so, can they get this package? Can they, the upgrades they bring in Spain, can they bring down the porpoising without actually changing the side pod philosophy? So if they can bring the porpoising down and then the car is still slow, then yes, you change the design philosophy of the car. But if you can bring the porpoising down and there's still inherent pace in the car, then you continue with the philosophy. So it's tough to pinpoint what exactly reduces the porpoising or what exactly increases the porpoising in the case of Mercedes. But it's not a one trick will solve the issue. Like I said, porpoising is an inherent consequence of underbody reliant cars. It's just the way it works. I'll try and link some explanations of porpoising in the description of this video, just so you get a better understanding of kind of what it is. But the season, we're seeing interesting battles shape up. Right now, we've got Charlotte and Max Verstappen seemingly ahead of, no, not seemingly, they're ahead of the field in how they're performing. And I think Red Bull has been killed by their reliability so far. They've had 2 DNFs for Max, I think 1 for Checo. But they seem to have a complete car in the same way that Ferrari seems to have a complete car, but Red Bull seems to have a more maneuverable car in the sense of they can work different things. Now, a trend I'm seeing is that, especially in Miami, actually we saw this in Imola as well. In Imola and Miami, Ferrari have struggled with the longevity of the tires. Their tire degradation has been seemingly higher, and that's kind of what Red Bull has capitalized on. Now, Max has been driving brilliantly, and it's been something he's continued since last year. But Charles has also been driving brilliantly. But we saw this especially in the sprint race, where around the last 2 laps, there was nothing Charles could do to defend because his tires were just not there. So it's all about now the development and how you work around the car. Now, Ferrari haven't been bringing development so far this season. They're planning apparently to bring a big upgrade package for Spain this weekend. So we'll see how that goes. But it's also interesting because, again, with the tires and degradation, we've moved to a larger diameter tire. We've moved from 13 inches to 18 inches, and that has different effects with a different sidewall, a different tire construction as well, and the way these cars interact with the tires. So there was still an understanding from teams to how to get these cars to work. It's Formula One is about constant development and constant learning, and we're seeing that now. It's whatever the outlook looks like now, 10 races down the line. I mean, this is a 22 race season and we're only in race 5, so by race 15, what will the complexion look like? What will teams be able to do in terms of the development of the car? How will they be able to work with the car? And it's interesting. Again, I think this was mentioned by Bryson. Again, I'll link all these guys in the description, right? But he said what's so interesting is that a lot of the times when a team commits a lot of resources to racing before a regulation change, they tend to suffer when the regulation changes kick in. And a lot of people on social media, me included, I was of the belief that Red Bull would suffer because they spent a lot of time last season developing the car into the season, right? Bringing upgrades for Max because it was in such a tough battle with Lewis Hamilton and by extension Mercedes for the championship. And we thought because Mercedes had pulled their development of the car so early into the season, we thought they would be the team to hit the ground running and Red Bull kind of wouldn't. But that's kind of worked out. It's flipped the coin and Red Bull have hit the ground running. They've got a good car and Mercedes are struggling. Now, a lot of things play into that, and this is slowly heading into another negative I have with the current regulations of Formula One. Obviously, design philosophy will play a role. Red Bull kind of went with a more traditional side pod air. I think the side pod is getting a lot of attention because it's one of the most visible differences with the cars. Red Bull went for a more traditional side pod design. Mercedes went with a radical no side pod, and obviously that's a difference, right? But the biggest difference, and it's a difference in regulation as well. And this is one thing I don't particularly know what Formula One are planning to do with, was the wind tunnel testing times. So for context, Formula One teams test in a wind tunnel. You basically put a car that's 60% the size, a scale model, and you test it in the wind tunnel in different scenarios and just how your aero package works. Now, we know Mercedes are struggling with correlation. This is what they've said, because their simulations and testing show something really good, and that's why they were so confident in their package. But they are struggling to translate that performance into on-track performance, and one of the biggest reasons is that the simulation doesn't account for porpoising. So now this is where the regulations come in. Now it came into effect from this year that based on your finishing order last year in the Constructors' Championship, you would get an allocation of wind tunnel and CFD time on an increasing scale, essentially. So the team that finishes first in the championship would get less than the team that finishes second, who would get less than the team that finishes third, etc., etc. So essentially, I think it resulted in a crazy ratio, like a Haas, which was the team that finished in bottom, getting 104, 107% more wind tunnel testing time than Mercedes. Now, what that means is it's very easy for a team to struggle to get to an aero philosophy or understand the aero philosophy because they've got less time. Now, the main aim of this was for Formula One to make it more competitive. You know, if the front-running teams would get less time to develop, then the teams that got more time would it would equalize the field. But I think, while I can understand the logic behind it, I think the biggest problem then becomes, why are we penalizing a team for excellence? Why must you get a penalty for being good? The cost cap, I think, is a better alternative to bringing teams closer, kind of equalize their resources. But with CFD time, it's an additional penalty for working within the remit of the rules. It's punishing you for being good, and I think that's the biggest problem. It now becomes anti-competition, because I think I said this to a friend on a few days ago or a week or so ago. Essentially, if you watch other sports, it's like saying, hey, Manchester City, you've been so good in the league for a while now that we're going to handicap you by saying you're going to get 2 days of training a week from now on, while other teams can train as much as they want. You understand? So I feel like it's attacking a team for being good. And now what it does is, obviously, a team will not sacrifice their position in the Constructors' Championship, because prize monies are awarded based on Constructors' Championship finishing. So the capital investment into a team is still a huge part of Formula One, especially when you've got a cost cap. So a Mercedes would not sacrifice finishing first in the Constructors just because they'd get a CFD and wind tunnel restriction because of how high they finished. The capital investment, the money prize, ultimately still weighs more than the penalty of the wind tunnel restriction, but it still feels anti-competition to say you're so good that we're going to penalize you. I think a better way around it would be equalize the resources, but don't punish teams for winning. And I think that's one of the biggest problems I've had with these cars. Oh yeah, points I glossed over. How terrible these cars look in slow corners, right? We kind of went on a tangent about porpoising, etc. But because these cars are so reliant on underbody aero, they're good in the really fast stuff because there's a lot of air moving under the car. But when the car is slow in slower corners, it just feels slow. It doesn't feel agile. as we've seen before. And you could see this in technical parts. If you look at Miami, the complex from, I think, turn 11 to turn 15, which is under the bridge, slow technical corners, the cars look sluggish and they look uninteresting. I've watched a few onboards now from different teams and different drivers. They look like a handful, which is always good from a challenge perspective, but they also look boring and uninteresting because of they're not able to maximize their potential, right? In the medium and fast stuff, they're good, they're fine, the aero is working. But in the slow stuff, it really looks boring. And it's further exacerbated by the large weight increase in the cars. Now, the weight was down to safety measures and other safety precautions added into the cars to make the sport more safer. I'm not going to complain about safety, but obviously a consequence of more weight is a penalty in performance. So the weight gain was, I think, on average around 40 kilograms, which is huge in the world of Formula One, where you're pinching weight wherever you can. Drivers need to be at a certain weight, cars need to be at a certain weight. If you can take weight off this, if you can remove paint, it's, again, weight is indirectly proportional to performance. So the less weight, the better the performance. And the increase in weight has really meant these cars were so sluggish in the corners and especially in the slow stuff. So I know people have been saying this for a while now, that Monaco might be more boring than Monaco usually is. But yeah, I started to see it, especially when we got to the slow complex in Miami, that the Monaco Grand Prix is going to be a struggle with these cars. It might be interesting, it might be bad, but the cars are just going to look so cumbersome and uninteresting in the corners because of the reliance on underbody aero and just the increased weight. And I think that's maybe, in the greater scheme of things, I don't think it's something that would necessitate a rethink of the rules or a re-amending of certain principles. But from a fan perspective and from someone who's watching the race, it's tough because it gets boring. The cars, sorry about that. The cars just don't look as good as you'd want them to. We could see with the previous generation cars how you could hustle them in slower corners. You got oversteer. You had to control. You were on a knife edge. With these cars, you get a lot of understeer in those slow corners, and you intentionally have to move so much slower because you don't have the performance to move faster. So overall, the regulations have been good for certain things that they targeted, but they've kind of been contra for other things. But they're also highlighting maybe the future of Formula One and how it's going to work going forward with the possible reduction of DRS and ultimately the complete removal of DRS from the sport, just how the climate and future of Formula One is looking going forward. So it still remains to be seen how the regulations pan out throughout the whole season, how teams can still develop before certain things get homologated going forward. So it's an interesting season to watch, but the regulations aren't perfect, as is the case with any regulation, to be fair. But there are a few certain things that I feel they should kind of rework or think about, and maybe some decisions, particularly with the limitation on CFD and wind tunnel time for the higher teams in the Constructors' Championship. Because it's not a fair reflection. Constructors' standings can be impacted by many things that don't necessarily have to do with on-track performance. Reliability and things like that can play a huge role in where you ultimately finish in the constructors. So, yeah, I think that needs a rethink. But overall, I'm still enjoying the racing. It's still Formula One, but some things need to be worked on. That's for sure. Now, second part of this podcast, and really this is the part I found interesting, and the part that I really, this and the following part, this is what I really wanted to talk about. The first part was kind of me doing the basic admin of those podcasts, get into Formula One, talk about what's happening. But this topic is something that's very interesting because it's something I've followed for a while now, and it's hinging on something that happened with Mercedes. Sorry, I'm a fan. but it's also about the wider view of Formula One. So if you look at Mercedes, right, and this is coming off the back of Miami, where there was a virtual safety car. I think it was after Mick and Sebastian had their contact, where there was a virtual safety car and subsequently a safety car, which meant Mercedes had a chance to pit Lewis Hamilton, but instead they kind of didn't. They asked him what he would like to do. And there was a lot of social media uproar, conversations about this, about what exactly are Mercedes doing with their strategy? Why are they asking a driver what he feels when they have so much more data on him? They've got GPS data. They kind of know what strategies the other teams are on. Why are you asking the driver what he wants to do? And subsequently, Lewis Hamilton kind of responded in kind in the post-race interview by saying he feels the team should have been more assertive in that call. They kind of should have told him, listen, Lewis, pit here. And I'll touch on that scenario, but this is the whole thing, like a Formula One strategy, the structure of a race strategy, and we've seen how pivotal strategies can be, especially when conditions are changing or a safety car is thrown out. We're going to skip Abu Dhabi because that shit show that really had nothing to do with strategy. But you look at races like Spain last year when Mercedes pulled a blind on Red Bull, and you look at France last year where Red Bull pulled a blind on Mercedes, and you look at Hungary, I think it was Hungary 2019 where Mercedes pulled a blind on Red Bull, and all these, you look at Russia last year where Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes were in sync to kind of let's pit, and ultimately that's what cost Lando Norris's maiden Formula One race win, because he chose to stay out on the slicks longer. Turned out to be a mistake, lost the lead. Max, even in the same race, kind of being at the further down towards the grid, kind of seeing the changing conditions and having the wherewithal in his team to say, okay, listen, let's pit now for Inters, subsequently finishing second. So it's the strategy. It's something and there have been a lot of criticisms that Mercedes haven't been on song with their strategy, especially last year coming into this year. A lot of people, myself included at certain moments, have felt that the strategy has been a bit of a letdown. But I wanted to touch on, and this is why I said this is the more interesting part, I wanted to touch on the structure of a Formula One race strategy. Now, as always, I do not work in Formula One. I'm just a guy who's passionate about the sport, who watches it week in, week out. And I converse with a lot of people and we try and get through these things. So a lot of the time when I present ideas on the podcast, on social media, it's usually after collating a few sources of information and having conversations with friends about what we feel could have been done, what we feel went wrong, and sometimes watching even professionals that work within the sport, how they dissect these type of things. And I'm trying to be the middleman between you, the listener, who might not be as in tune with the sport, but kind of, work it out with you. And trying to be in the middle with you and the sport. So here's my thing on a Formula One race strategy. People always talk about the perfect strategy. Well, what's the perfect strategy? Well, the perfect strategy is ultimately the strategy that results in you winning a race. It's perfect, right? Or maximizing on the potential of your points. That's a perfect strategy. But something we have to talk about is what exactly is the fundamental of a strategy. Now, in Formula One, the main aim of a strategy is firstly to comply with the rules. Let's say you have to use two different compounds in a race. The only exception being when it's a wet race, you could literally run on the wet tires until the end or intermediates. But if it's a dry race, you have to use two of the three allotted compounds for that race. As you know, we've got the softs, the mediums, and the hards. You have to use two of the three. So that means there is a mandatory pit stop in the race. Now, firstly, that's the main point, to comply with the regulation. Now, and the other point of a strategy is to complete the regulations and complete a race in the shortest possible time. Now, what this means is that you have to time your pit stop so that it's literally shorter than everyone. And this is where we see teams go about it differently. You see a team like Red Bull, they have structured their team dynamics and their strategy to rely on the shortest possible pit stop they can do. And this is something they've perfected. And this is why every year Red Bull have the shortest average pit stop time and the fastest pit stop every season. It's just something they do. I think the record stands at 1.8 seconds, which was set by Red Bull, I think 2 years ago now. Obviously, that's different now because the tires are extremely heavier. The wheels and tires are extremely heavy, so it's a different dynamic to running a pit stop. And we had the regulations that the FIA added last year to kind of slow everybody down. Another controversy altogether, but the main aim is to run your race in the shortest period of time. And that's why a strategy kind of relies on outside factors such as a virtual safety car, which essentially slows down everyone on track. So when you pit during a virtual safety car or a full safety car, you lose less time because everyone else is moving slow compared to a normal racing scenario. So that's kind of the basics of a strategy. Now, then we have to go into what a team has to do to make a strategy work. And this is why I said people talk about a perfect strategy. A strategy can rely on something like an undercut, meaning if you're following someone, you pit before them and go faster so that when they pit, they come out behind you. Or you go for an overcut where you stay out longer, and eventually when you pit, you've created a big enough gap that you actually get in front of the other guy. So there's a few avenues of how to make a strategy work. But again, the perfect strategy is the one that enables you to win a race or maximize on your points. But what often goes unsaid is sort of the compromises that need to be made for a strategy, right? The compromises can be to be slower in the first stint to make a strategy work, or to go out longer in a stint to make the strategy work. So perfect is oftentimes subjective to what your team goal is, so there isn't a universal perfect strategy. It's situational that the strategy becomes perfect. If you look at something like Mercedes back in Russia last year, and you compare how their strategy went to McLaren, they were equal up until the conditions changed and it started raining. The perfect strategy was to pit Lewis Hamilton when he did, because ultimately that led to him moving from second and winning the race. The imperfect strategy was to try and stay out longer, like Lando Norris, who eventually finished, I think, 8th in that race by staying out a lap too long. So strategies are ever evolving, and I think what so often happens, and I've been guilty of this, as I know you, the person who's listening to this podcast, has been as well, is that we watch Formula One from the outside. We're not privy to a lot of the information that teams have to go through every race weekend, the simulations that they run, the models that they run, the time that they work out, the degradation on their tires, how much they're losing per lap, the time difference, the deltas. We're not really privy to that information. So what happens is we see a manifestation of a strategy happening on screen, and then we comment on the strategy after the fact, and we always compare after. So meaning we're using hindsight. Oh, you know what? If you pitted a lap earlier, that would have worked better because there wasn't a safety car, or there was a safety car. Or if you didn't pit at this time, if you went for maybe another 3 laps, and right. And the problem with that is we're judging based on results, not on present information. So if you look at teams have to implement these strategies on the fly. Yes, you may have a model or a prediction of how you want the race to go, but because the conditions are ever changing, you have to go through a lot of data, right? And you have to make oftentimes a decision that hinges on a 5-second window of crunching down data to say, are we pitting now or are we going longer? And yes, I know the teams have a tremendous number of people who are just involved in the process. A lot of people are involved in the pit stop process, and a lot of people work on those strategies, but we see the after effects and we criticize teams, rightly or wrongly. Criticism is always a good thing, and I think something that endears us more and brings us closer to the sport. But it also pushes us further from the reality that these teams have to go through a lot of information before they can decide what the optimal strategy is. And going back to what happened in Miami with Mercedes asking Lewis Hamilton how he felt, I think, yes, the team should have been more assertive in their strategy, telling him to pit or not. But I don't think there was an optimal strategy in that scenario. Either way, I think he was going to lose a position to George. And one thing that I wanted to point out is them asking Lewis Hamilton how he felt is maybe something that got lost in the optics, right? And I think Lewis Hamilton was frustrated that his team didn't take an assertive stance on that situation, and that's fine. He's well within his right. But I think from a fan perspective, we often forget that a strategy also hinges on what the driver says to the team, because as much as a team can go through data and analyze and look at where the other guys are and go through all of that and then say to a driver, listen, pit now, there's also an element of how a driver feels in the car. Now, we can look at comparative lap deltas between a driver and the laps and a driver and another driver, competition and other cars. And what happens is sometimes you get it that a driver doesn't particularly agree with what the team is saying because they still feel comfortable on a set of tires. They possibly feel that they can go longer or they want to go shorter because they are the ones who are experiencing how the car is behaving on track. Understeer, oversteer, grip in corners, how the car's just reacting, overheating and such. Now, those are certain conditions that the team can't necessarily input into their strategy because, again, the race is always a fluid thing and it changes. So that's where driver input. So I think the message between Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton got lost in there somewhere, but the optimum or the perfect strategy is a difficult thing to attain. And I think what you have to consider, and this is a big consideration that we tend to neglect when it comes to strategy, is that strategy is heavily reliant on your package. What do I mean by that? The comparative performance of your car to the performance of another car is ultimately what also decides your strategy. If you have a car that's really fast, like if you look at Mercedes in 2019, 2020, 2018, when they were pulling off these brilliant strategies, a lot of that is down to your driver and their confidence in the car. How can they make the strategy work? Telling a driver to go 5 laps longer on a set of tires ultimately depends on the rate of degradation in your package. So if your car uses up tires quicker than the opposition, then it's not a viable strategy to tell your driver to go longer. And ultimately, if you have a faster car, you will eventually make up places. So sacrificing an earlier pit stop, or sometimes even an extra pit stop in a one-stop race, you do a two-stop, depends on your package, depends on the car. And I think what you're seeing now is when teams look at comparative performances, their strategy changes. Mercedes have, and maybe this is a consequence of Mercedes being in the front for so long, in that the strategy game becomes different when your car is slower and when your car is in the midfield, as opposed to when your car was easily 10 seconds a race, 10, 20 seconds a race, faster than everyone. You could kind of take strategies that your car could make work, but those strategies aren't possible now. And if you look at Red Bull, because they have a car that languishes in the front, even particularly last year as well, they don't have to take as risky a strategy as they did before to compensate for the deficiency of their car in ultimate race pace. So the package and the confidence your driver has in the car speaks volumes. If you look at Mercedes, they've struggled with tire warm-up this year, and that's a critical stuff. And we saw it particularly in Bahrain when Lewis Hamilton went onto the hards. It took him quite a few laps to get those hards up to temperature, and we saw him struggle on his out lap. So issues like that play a role in how you strategize and how calm or how under pressure you are when it comes to strategy. And I think it's important to understand that the perfect strategy doesn't exist. It's just an optimum strategy based on a situation, based on a race, based on a day, based on a second, based on a lap. So I think it's always interesting to study the strategies and what teams could do. If you look at the AWS graphics, trust me, it's not my favorite thing either, but it's there for a reason. Pirelli will send out predictions of, based on these conditions, we feel that this race could be a 2-stop or it could be a 1-stop. And then you often get a driver making a ridiculous strategy against the predictions work. Alex Albon in Australia doing, 56 laps on the hards. Lewis Hamilton 2020 Turkey running the whole race on inters, essentially turning the inters into a dry, slick tire, And you look at, there's so many strategies, and sometimes they fail. You look at Red Bull in Baku last year when Max Verstappen had the blowout. Okay, maybe that's not the best example because there are rumors that Red Bull were running different pressures, but these things happen. Valtteri Bottas in Qatar, he had the puncture. Actually, multiple people had a puncture in Qatar last year. So those things play a role in how the ultimate strategy of the team comes about. So I think one thing we have to take note of and be cognizant of is just how much goes into a strategy. A strategy, there's a model or there's a prediction made over the race weekend, but that prediction can be totally thrown out of the books if you have an evolving situation on track. Case in point, Hungary 2021, the Valtteri Bottas incident that ultimately took out 4-5-ish cars, and then you had a drying track, and then something like that messes up your strategy prediction. So it's such a fluid thing that when it comes to strategy, you need to be aware, and sometimes it goes wrong, sometimes it goes right. But I don't think it's as simple as we think it is, because we watch the results and not the whole process. Got me? Good. Right. So, yeah, we've gone deep into this podcast. I actually didn't think it would take this long. So, yeah, I've been talking too much. So let's wrap it up. Let's wrap it up with the last thing, right? And it's a conversation that I really didn't want to touch on, but I thought would be interesting to touch on, is the chats around a driver and the car. Is it the car that's faster or the driver, etc., etc.? And I'm really going to sum it down because a friend asked me this question. An acquaintance of mine is getting into Formula One, particularly this year, and they asked me, "Oh, what happened to Lewis Hamilton? Is he past it? Has he lost his edge?" Lewis Hamilton, has he lost his edge? He's so much slower now. And I had to say, no, it's the car. There's problems with the car. And they're like, oh, but when he was winning, you didn't say it was the car. And I was like, and maybe that creates a narrative for some people. And maybe it's a tough concept to understand. But I'll do it like this. In motorsport, the car will always play a role in who is champion. That's just plain simple fact. You cannot remove the car from a championship because it is the most important resource on track. It's the car. The driver will also always play a role in the car, in the development of the car and in the ultimate driving of the car. You will not have the slowest driver on the grid winning a championship just because they're in the fastest car. And unfortunately, it always happens. Fortunately or unfortunately, depends on your perspective, but the teams with the most resources, meaning the most finances, the best team, the best engineers, the best infrastructure, will have the opportunity to build the best car and the financial means to hire the fastest driver. A Lewis Hamilton in the Mercedes, a Michael Schumacher at Ferrari, a Max Verstappen at Red Bull, and Ayrton Senna at McLaren, and Alan Prost at McLaren. A Nigel Mansell at Williams, and Alan Prost at Williams, and Niki Lauda at Ferrari. You see what I'm getting at? It's a lot of champions are often champions because of where they are at the time. Now, it's not to say that, but someone has won championships in different cars, because cars are not always stagnant. Some years, some cars are better than others. So it also depends on where you are at a certain time. And the biggest controversy was when it came to Lewis Hamilton, the fastest car narrative was weaponized to say he was only winning because he has the fastest car, but now he's losing because he's past it. And one of the things a lot of people can't understand is, how do you differentiate between a team having a fast car or it all being down to the driver? And I think the easiest way is to compare between teammates, because teammates more often than not drive. I wish you could see my reactions. I'm doing these faces and I'm nodding, and more often than not, drivers within the same team drive a similar car. So whoever comes out on top is usually the better driver. Max Verstappen against Alex Albon, Max Verstappen versus Pierre Gasly, Max Verstappen versus Checo Perez, Lewis Hamilton versus Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton versus Valtteri Bottas, Lewis Hamilton versus Fernando Alonso. And you can do that for all teams. Charles Leclerc versus Carlos Sainz currently. Sebastian Vettel versus Mark Webber, Sebastian Vettel versus Daniel Ricciardo. You can play with these things and looking at a time where a driver comes out on top against their teammate. And sometimes they change, that's not to say, but you have to look at a totality of their journey. Valtteri Bottas even admitted that he feels he's not as good a driver as Lewis Hamilton, but he did have races where he beat Lewis Hamilton and qualifying performances where he was faster than Lewis Hamilton. But overall, Lewis Hamilton had way better statistics, same as Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg. Nico Rosberg won a title in 2016 against Lewis Hamilton, but in their time at Mercedes, I think the title challenge was 4-1, or 3-1, something like that. So you have to look at these things, and that's how you compare. But another way we compare is you look at the performance of the car relative to other cars. And you look at sectors, you look at where the car struggles, and this is where you have to look at how people drive. Now, if you take comparative laps with different drivers and you look at their driver input, and I think Peter Windsor, again, I'll tag these pages and things in the description, but Peter Windsor always talks about the way drivers drive, the inputs they have, the way they control the car, the way they can manipulate the car into corners. That's how you judge who a good driver is. It's like football. How do you judge who's a good player? You can't always look at the accolades, because accolades are dependent on a team, and a team with more resources, with more money to sign better players, is going to win. You sometimes have to look at the individual performances, the technical skills that are there. How does this player trap, pass, cross, run, read the game? And it's the same in motorsport. How does this driver manipulate the car? How does this driver drive the car, essentially? How are their inputs? How are their traces? You can find data readings from all these things. How are they different to their teammates? How are their hand movements? If you watch onboards, you see the differences in how drivers go around the track. You see the smoothness of their hands, the quickness when they need to be. You see if there's telemetry, or you can hear how they apply the throttle, how they manipulate the acceleration, the deceleration, how you brake, how you bleed off the brakes. These are all racing techniques that ultimately decide who's a better driver, who has an inherent dexterity to how they manipulate the car. And that's really how we judge how people drive. And this is where we can differentiate the car from the driver. Like I said, to win a championship, to be competitive, both things have to be in sync. the good drivers will often be in the best cars, and you kind of put that together. But it can happen that you find a really good driver in a really bad car, or it doesn't really even need to be a really bad car, but it's a car that's not as competitive, and you have to look at how they perform. And I think one of the best indicators of that is someone like Lewis Hamilton, who has been in Formula One since 2007, and that's what, 15, 16 years in the sport. And 16 years is a long time in any sport, but in Formula One, it's further elongated by different teams he's driven for. Granted, he's driven for two teams, McLaren and Mercedes. Yes, they do have links, but it's McLaren and Mercedes. It's two teams. But you have to look at the change in regulations. We went from the naturally aspirated V8 cars to the blown diffuser era, to different air regulations, to longer cars, shorter cars, wider cars, to the turbo hybrids of 2014 and further. Now we've got the more underbody reliant cars. So there's a lot of regulations that change, and how you decide the quality of a driver is, especially when they've been in the sport long enough, is you look at the performances over these different times. And Lewis Hamilton is still the only driver to win a race in every season of Formula One he's competed in. Now that's an impressive record, but it's also impressive to say this is how you can judge the class of a driver. Now this year, I think it's going to be very tough to win a race, but still a long way to go. But that's ultimately the things. You have to look at those skills and the competencies to judge whether a driver is good or whether it's down to the car. So to ultimately win a championship, you need a good driver and you need a good car. There's no separating the two. The problem becomes when you diminish the effort of one or the other over the other. When you diminish the efforts of the driver because the car is good, or you diminish the efforts of the team because the car is bad and the driver is good. Sometimes things just happen, but you need both to be working in sync to enable winnings, to enable a race win, a championship win, a constructors championship win. So I think that's conclusively how I can put the whole, is it the driver or is it the car? Who's faster? Who's more important? Because it's hard to quantify. You can't say, oh, well, the car is 80% of it and the driver is 20%, because sometimes you put a slow driver in a fast car and they can't do anything with it. So what are you saying then? You see what I mean? So it's a symbiotic relationship between the car, the driver, and the team, and you need to put all those things together. And one of the things people always say is look at the feeder series where all the teams are running identical spec cars. But the problem then is the teams play a difference. The teams with the best simulators, the teams with the best infrastructure, the teams with the best mechanics, the teams with the best trainers. See where I'm getting at? It's a symbiotic relationship between the team, the driver, and the car. There's always that give or take. So I think that's as conclusive as I can put this. And thank you for listening to this podcast, because, we went longer than I expected to. I didn't think it would be this long, but I started enjoying myself because I've been quiet this season. Hopefully, I'll try and put more efforts into getting more of these podcasts out. But for those out there, small numbers. But again, someone pointed out to me, it's really not about how far you reach, it's about who you reach. And if for the 5 people that may be listening, or the 10 or the 20, whatever, if they are enjoying what you're putting out, then it's worth the effort. And to those that continuously listen to these podcasts and engage with me on social media, thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I really will like to say, I still enjoy making these podcasts, and I still enjoy being active on social media, especially about a sport that I'm so passionate about. So to a future with Talk with Tup,